Anytime.
I'll go ahead and get started. We're five minutes early, but I'll go 5 minutes late, and so they'll make up for it. Oh, I'm supposed to stand right here, rooted to the spot, aren't I?
Talk loud when you move away.
Okay. So by popular demand, we're going to talk about Israel, Palestine, and Gaza today. Yes, sir.
We'll be talking about the West Bank.
Of course we will.
Okay.
No, yeah, we will. West Bank's in there as well. So, and all of this we'll have a discussion about this. So, bring your observations and so forth. So, first, some terms that people tend to get confused. Jews, those are followers of the religion Judaism. It's a religious and cultural designation. It is not an ethnic designation. There's no such thing as an ethnic Jew. Okay? What that means is if I wanted to, I could become a Jew. My ethnicity would not change when that happened. Okay, so being a Jew is a religious term. It's also a cultural term, but not an ethnic term. Okay? Hebrew is an ethnic term, and it describes some, but certainly not all Jews. Probably most Jews are of European descent, not Hebrew. Okay? Hebrews and Arabs are very closely related ethnically, and their languages were one language at one time that diverged. So they were the same people at one point. Hebrews and Arabs were. But not all Jews are Hebrews. Okay? Palestinian is an ethnic term. It refers to a certain kind of Arab. And Arab is an ethnic term too, but it refers to a certain kind of Arab. So it also refers to anybody who acknowledges Palestinian political authority, and will almost certainly be the national term to refer to people who live in an independent country of Palestine if that ever happens. Okay, like we're Americans, that's our national term, they'd be Palestinians. Okay. Israeli is a national term. It refers to anybody who is a citizen of the state of Israel. It is not a religious term or a cultural term even so much as just a national term. Although it has cultural ramifications, like American has cultural ramifications. Okay. Everybody clear on that? Yes. Okay. Now, background on the geography of Israel. This area which we call Israel today has had a lot of different names in the past. The Canaan was the original biblical name, and you of course see that used a lot in biblical context. And this is a map of the extent of Canaan at the time of Joshua, when Joshua came in and ruined it all. Well, ruined it from the Canaanites' point of view.
Ruined it from the Canaanites.
From the Canaanites' point of view, yeah.
And there is milk and honey in that.
There is milk and honey, both. But they didn't have chocolate, so why bother? Is right. Israel and Judea, most of Jewish biblical history is how this is referred to here. Judah, or Judea, Judah, same place, is a kingdom to the south. Israel is a kingdom to the north. They had separate kings for quite a long time. But they were basically all Jews, okay? And for a part of that time, there was another group right in the middle here called Samaria, where the Samaritans lived. And that's what the geography was like when Jesus was a boy, or when he was alive, you know. Samaria was in there too. And nobody liked the Samaritans, okay? There's people in Israel and people in Judah, neither one liked the Samaritans. Okay, from about 100 AD to 1948, so for almost 2,000 years, it was called Palestine. All of this is called Palestine. And so this is a map from the 1940s showing the extent of Palestine. Okay, so for a long time, that's what this was called, Palestine. And from 1948 to today, it's called Israel. And that's what this country is today. So just some clarification on those terms. So there was a state of Palestine for a long time. So summarizing all of this, Jews dominated the area for about 1,400 years. Okay, from approximately 1250 BC, which is a rough date for Joshua's conquest of Canaan, to about 70 AD, and since 1948. Palestinians have dominated the area for about 1,850 years, from about 100 AD to 1948. Okay, so it was a Palestinian area, and Palestinians lived there. Okay. The issue today is how to find mutually satisfying living space for both Jews and Palestinians in the region. Yes.
So in 100 AD,
That's an approximate date, by the way.
where did the Palestinians come from?
Well, they were always there, but this is, it became Palestinian because the Jews were forced out.
Okay.
And so by having the Jews leave, which we'll talk about in a minute, it left the Palestinians as the only people standing, basically.
So where did you send?
That was the diaspora, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So.
Okay, so Palestinians are people that lived in the area but weren't Jewish.
Right.
Okay.
Although today there are Palestinian Jews and there are Palestinian Christians, because you can just simply join a religion, you know.
Right.
But at the time, anybody who was a Palestinian who became a Jew would have been considered a Jew and would have been driven out. And so only non-Jewish Palestinians were left behind for the most part. Okay. What's that? Christians hung on a little bit better in that area, but they also were not dominant. But as you know, in Acts, the book of Acts, the Christian church at Jerusalem was a big deal, and for a long time. James, the brother of Jesus, was the pastor at Jerusalem, or one of the big wheels at Jerusalem for a long time. No, not at all. Well, at this time, they were mostly, it would have been probably considered an animistic polytheistic religion, because Islam had not been invented yet in 100 AD. And
well,
that,
at that time, it would have been, it would have been
like tribal religions, yeah.
Possibly Egyptian influence.
Yeah.
Possibly Roman influence.
Yeah, a lot of Greek. Greeks influenced everybody in this area, including Christians and Jews and everybody else. And we'll talk about, oh no, that's the other talk. That's the Gnosticism talk.
Yeah, we won't go there.
We won't go there. Forget that. Forget the Greeks. So we're trying to figure out how to find places for both of these groups to live. And I want to look at their claims. You know, they each have a claim to this land. They each say, we should be here. And those claims are based on these things: religion, law, practicality, morality, and security. So let's go through those. And we're going to see the big sticky issue here is both sides have really good claims to the land. And they're equally good. So everybody's right. That's the problem with this. And trying to find a solution to this is going to be the problem. Okay? So in terms of religion, the Jewish claim to Israel, Judaism holds, as you all know, that Abraham made a covenant with Yahweh. We're guessing 2,000 years ago. It's not clear exactly. 4?
2,000 years ago.
2000 BC, 4,000 years ago. Thank you. Yeah, that's 2,000 years ago is Jesus, right? They were around good. Thank you. Yeah, that's right. And the covenant was, if the Jews obeyed the commandments of Yahweh, then Yahweh, the descendants of Abraham, excuse me, would be giving a land which now is called Israel. It's called the Promised Land. And the Jews believe they are descendant of Abraham through Abraham's son Isaac. So they trace their lineage through Isaac, and then that's where they came from. Okay? And as you know, Jerusalem is the most holy city in all of Judaism. It is the center of everything in Judaism. Okay? The Palestinian claim to Israel, by the way, the Palestinians became Muslim probably 700 AD, something like that. So for a long time they've been Muslim, and their identity mostly is as Muslims. Muslims also believe that Allah made a covenant with Abraham, who they call Ibrahim, and Islam holds Abraham as one of the greatest prophets in existence. So Abraham is a big deal, really big deal in Islam. Arabs believe they're descendants of Abraham's son Ishmael. So Abraham had another son, Ishmael, with Hagar. And Muhammad is a direct descendant of Ishmael. And so this covenant applies to Muslims as well. You see, because that's Abraham's ancestry also. So is that clear? And Jerusalem is the third most holy place in Islam. So Mecca is number one, Medina is number two, Jerusalem's number three. And originally, as you know, Muslims bow and face Mecca when they pray. Originally, Muhammad had them bowing and facing Jerusalem when they prayed. So Jerusalem is a really big deal to Muslims. And one of the most holy sites in all of Islam is in Jerusalem. That's where Muhammad was taken up to heaven in a fire chariot. It's from Jerusalem. Sorry about that. Okay? So they both have a religious claim to the land, and it's approximately equally strong, right? You're going to see that all of these claims are equally strong to the land. Okay? What was that? It's Abraham's fault. If Abraham had no children, none of this would have happened. We will. We'll get to that a little bit later. Second claim, the legal claim, law claim, legal claim. According to the law, the United Nations mandated a Jewish state in Palestine in 1948. And the United Nations mandated a Palestinian state in Palestine in 1948. So in 1948, the UN said there should be a Jewish state and there should be a Palestinian state. And you'll see the borders of what they drew and where each one was supposed to be and all that. The Palestinian state never happened. The Jewish state did, and that's Israel.
What was going on in 1948 that they needed to mandate that?
This is when Israel, well, if you can wait.
Yeah, that's how I was like, are you going to get?
Yeah, we're going to get to all that. Okay. What about the practicality of it all? Okay, well, the Jewish practicality claim is they've lived in this area for many, many generations. And since about 1947, the area has been overtly Jewish, and the Jewish state of Israel has built the land up into a modern, well-functioning state. So it's like, well, of course, this is our land. Look what we've done here. Kind of. But the practical claim for the Palestinians is the Palestinians have occupied the land continuously for almost all of the last 2,000 years. And were booted out by the Israelis. But practically, we've been here for 2,000 years, you know? So they have a practical claim too. What about the moral claim? Morality. Jews have been systematically persecuted by Christians for 1,000 years at least. You know about the Holocaust of World War II. 6 million Jews were killed by Nazi Germany and their allies. In response to that, the UN, just after World War II, this is the timing of it, in 1947, the UN felt it was necessary to give the Jews their own state, so they could have a place to escape this 1,000-year horrid persecution that Christians have put them under. Interestingly enough, there was very little Muslim persecution of Jews. It was almost all Christian. In fact, during the Ottoman Empire, which was the largest Muslim-based empire in the Middle East ever, Jews were called the dhimmi, which means a protected minority. And they were protected from persecution and allowed to practice their religion and so forth. Okay. So it was mostly Christians who did that. But the moral claim for the Palestinians, since 1948, they've been forcibly removed from land they occupied for thousands of years and forced to live in squalid and overcrowded refugee camps, which are miserable places. Israelis have inflicted humiliating treatment on them, curfews limiting access to resources, low-paying jobs, limited mobility and basic rights such as speech and gathering and so forth. And they need a state for their own protection. They too need to be protected from the kind of persecution they're going through. That's the moral claim. Okay? Now, all of this is not from the Palestinian point of view. All of this is documented. Israelis have treated them extremely poorly, really poorly.
Okay, so can you separate out so when you're referring to Israelis?
Okay, Jews are the followers of Judaism. It's a religious term. Israeli is a national term, so the Israeli is the state of Israel is what we're referring to. Oh yeah, and most people in Israel are Jews, but not everybody. We're getting to all that too. If you could just wait a little bit, we'll talk about all that.
Yeah, they're not.
Yeah, they've been separated out. Most of the Israelis are Jews? Yeah, but they're not treating them poorly because they're Jews. They're treating them poorly because they're Israelis, because it's an Israeli national policy. It's like the same thing as saying Americans, what have we done that was terrible? The Japanese internment camps. That was not a Christian thing, even though Christians are the majority of the United States. It was a national policy by the United States. And that's what we're talking about here, is national policy by Israel. Not because they're Jews, but because national policy. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. Okay. Morality. Okay, now, what about security claim? The Jews especially feel the need for a place of safety after the last 1,000 years, where they have not been safe anywhere in the world they've been. A minority of Palestinians have used terrorist tactics against Israel, in some cases killing civilians, so there's the continual need for security. So they feel a need to have their land for their own security and right to exist, basically. Palestinians have been denied basic rights of expression, have no way to affect change through the political process. They can't. They have no power politically, basically. So inevitably, a small minority are going to adopt what's called extra-legal means. That means terrorist, criminal, bad ways of doing things. The Israeli response is far out of proportion, though, as we've seen right now. Many more Palestinians have been killed by Israelis than the other way around. Many more. Palestinians need a place where they can escape refugee camps and feel safe in their own land. So they need to have their own security as well. Okay? So that's the Palestinian claim to Israel. So you put all this together, and they each have strong claims to the same land. And this is why it's been such an intractable problem It's why nobody can seem to solve this problem. Because no matter what you do, somebody's going to get hosed, and somebody else is going to get all the gravy, So that's the problem. So let's look at a summary of Jewish political history. Jesus died around 30 AD, right? Approximately, that neighborhood, maybe 29, something like that. And so about 30 years later, a little bit more than 30 years later, you all know they were part of the Roman Empire. And Rome was not treating them particularly well either. Rome was not benevolent overlords at all. They were rough. And during the time of Jesus, you had Barabbas, who was a revolutionary, who said, let's get the Romans. And a lot of people wanted Jesus to get the Romans, and all this kind of stuff. So that feeling had been there for a while, and it percolated and developed, and by 66 AD, a full-blown revolution took place. And the Jews rose up all across the area in a military revolution. They were fighting the Romans. And because they'd had enough, okay? It was a bloody fight for independence. A lot of people died. It was pretty awful. It went on for about 3 or 4 years, and it was inevitable the Romans were going to win. It would be something like Albania fighting the United States or something like that in terms of military power, but they hung on for a long time with a lot of heroism and all that kind of stuff. And so when the Romans crushed the revolution in 70 AD, in order to keep this from ever happening again, they destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, which cut at the very heart of what it meant to be Jewish. And they drove all the Jews out of Israel. They said, you had to leave, you had to go. And this is when the Palestinians, who were not part of this whole thing, were kind of left standing as the only non-Roman, non-Greek people around. And that, the Jews, when they left Israel in 70 AD, it took a few decades for all this to happen, but they started leaving in 70 AD. That's called the diaspora. That's the term that's applied to that. And it looked like this. Got to have a map, right? We got lots of maps today. Oh, I'm in my element. I love maps. This color here, this orange color, is the Roman Empire. Okay? And you see it obviously included, Israel. The red lines are schematic diagrams showing where the Jews went. I've always been irritated that they don't have a line going up to here because there was a Jewish kingdom called the Khazars that was founded in the Caucasus Mountains that thrived for centuries. They don't have that. Oh, darn. Oops. Where are we going? Okay. But there was a very strong Jewish imprint all across North Africa. And consequently a strong Jewish Christian influence across North Africa too. In fact, a lot of the main dynamic forces of Christianity were in North Africa. Augustine was a North African, for example. We'll talk about, no, that's the other talk. We won't talk about him today. But a lot of them went into Europe as well. And so this is the diaspora, okay? Most Jews eventually came to be concentrated in West Europe. So they kind of made their way up into this area here initially. So by about 1000 AD, this is where most Jews were, in this area right here, after about 1000 years. But the Middle Ages was wildly anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish. Here's a little fun fact for you. Hebrew and Arabic are such closely related languages. They have the same numbers, for example. They count the same. They have a lot of the same cognate words and things like that. That they are put together into a family of languages called the Semitic languages, which means technically anti-Semitic means not only anti-Jewish, but anti-Arab as well. But nobody uses the term that way. Anti-Semitic always refers to anti-Jewish. So with that rise in anti-Semitism, which was pretty bad, and the Crusades had a lot to do with this. So the Crusades were really bad for the Jews, really, really bad for the Jews. Christians behaving badly to the max. There's nothing glorious about the Crusades. This is something that I wish I could snap my fingers and make never have happened. And the world would be such a better place if the Crusades had never happened. But that's beside the point. Between 1100 and 1300 AD, Jews were forced out of Western Germany, an area called the Rhineland. They were forced to leave on pain of death by their Christian neighbors. Most went east and settled in Poland. In 1400, the Jews were banished from France. In 1492, the Jews were banished from Spain. 1492 was a big year for Spain. They not only finished the reconquest of Spain by driving out the last of the Muslims, and they banned Jews and confiscated their property. There's some evidence that that confiscated property was what helped finance Columbus's 1492 expedition to America. That was all tied together. And between 13 and 1500, the Jews continued to flee Western Europe and settle in Eastern Europe. So now we go back to our map here. The black lines are the expulsions from Western Europe for the most part. And for the most part, they end up concentrating over here in Eastern Europe. Okay? So between 15 and 1700s, they were relegated to ghettos. Ghetto is a Yiddish word. Yiddish is the language most Jews were speaking in Eastern Europe. It's a conflation of German and Hebrew. And ghetto is a Yiddish word and describes the neighborhoods they were in. They were awful neighborhoods. They were basically like refugee camps, more or less. And they were forced to live there, and they couldn't leave. And this area, modern Poland, Belarus, and Western Russia, was so concentrated with Jews, it was called the Pale of Settlement. Pale in this context comes from a Russian word, which means boundary or demarcation line or something like that. And so basically it described the boundary which Jews were not allowed to cross. They had to stay within that area on pain of imprisonment or possibly death or whatever. And so this is the Pale of Settlement here. You may not be able to see what's going on here. This is modern day Poland. It's here, and Belarus is in here, and this is Russia. Okay, over here is Ukraine. This is the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea, and Sweden and Finland and Estonia and so forth. Okay. Anti-Semitism continued to be very strong. I mean, Adolf Hitler didn't come out of nowhere. You know, he came out of a very strong tradition of anti-Semitism. He learned this as a child, basically, to hate Jews. He's just decided to do something about it. And especially in Eastern Europe, in the Pale of Settlement, it was really bad. And Russia started pogroms, which I believe, now I almost said something which I'm not sure of. I think pogrom might be a Yiddish word too, but it might be a Russian word. I don't know. But pogrom is an official campaign against another people to try to destroy them. It's ethnic cleansing is what it is, basically. Or in this case, religious cleansing. And the Russia launched a number of these pogroms in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And this is when most of the Jews who came to the United States came during this time. They were fleeing the pogroms in Eastern Europe. That's when because we had very few Jews in the United States until about 1890. And by 1920, we had several million Jews, okay? And it was in 1920, by the way, that the first anti-immigration law was passed, which was aimed directly at the Jews, because people didn't want the Jews here. So, Jews and Italians. So with these pogroms, if you all know Fiddler on the Roof, right? And in the Fiddler on the Roof, this Jewish community in Russia is forced to leave. That's one of the pogroms. And they said they're going to Chicago, which a lot of Jews did. So, it's a self-fulfilling hatred. You know, you do it, and then you learn it, and so you do it because you learned it, and you teach your children to do it. Well, because they killed Christ, and because they're weird, and because they're the other. They're the other. No, the Jews did nothing to deserve this. You know, and it was the Romans that killed Christ, not the Jews. So let's make that clear too. So let's hate the Italians because the Romans killed Christ. We did hate the Italians, you know. They smelled funny because they used garlic all the time. Boy, people hated garlic because it reminded them of Italians. I can't imagine eating without garlic. My gosh, it's my favorite spice. Or is it a spice? Additive, whatever. Anyway, as a result of all this unhappiness in Eastern Europe, this movement called Zionism developed. Zion is a biblical term that means Jerusalem, and it also, in expanded form, means Israel, but it means Jerusalem literally. So Mount Zion means Jerusalem in the Bible. And Zionism is a movement that I just lost the name of the guy who was the big proponent of it. But anyway, he was very influential. Why did I forget his name?
Don't worry about it.
I'm going on, moving on. But the basic notion of that is saying, let's go to Israel. Let's go to Israel and get away from all of this persecution that we've had in Europe. The Europeans have made it clear they hate us. Let's not go there, you know. And so they were going to go to Israel and reclaim the space of the Jewish homeland. That's what Zionism is all about. But this was a very contentious issue amongst Jews. A lot of Jews did not like the idea of Zionism at all. They said a lot of them wanted to go to the United States or other places. Argentina got a lot of Jews, and other places did too, because they were going all over the place. And so a lot of them said, no, we don't want to do that, you know. And so it was very contentious whether they should be a Zionist or shouldn't be a Zionist, and just kind of divided the Jewish community for sure. But enough responded that by 1914, so picture in that time frame is, that's kind of after Zionism had been getting started, 8% of the people in Palestine were Jews, okay? And it kept getting bigger, 16% by 1931 and 31% by 1940. But they were still a vast minority. They were not at all mostly Jews in Palestine. It was still overwhelmingly Palestinian. Very few problems with Palestinians at this point. You know, there was room enough for everybody, and they shared, okay, for the most part. And we should make it clear, if I don't say this overtly, I want to say it right now. They are not fighting over religion. They are not fighting because you are Jewish and you're Muslim. They're fighting over land and water. Who gets to live on the land and who gets the water? That's what they're fighting about. This is not a religious thing. They're identified by religious terms, but that's not the core issue. Okay, impact of World War I. Oh my gosh, worst peace treaty ever was the treaty that ended World War I. And the bad guys in World War I were three large empires: the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, which dominated Bulgaria as well. The Ottoman Empire is the one we're interested in, because they covered most of what is today the fussy part of the Middle East. Okay. But the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, what they did, the whole mood of that peace treaty was to see how hard they could punish the bad guys to make life miserable for them. And so what they did was they broke up all three of those empires into other states. And brand new countries came to be that had never existed before. Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, none of these countries had ever existed before. Kuwait had never existed before as a country. But they broke up these empires, and when they dissected the Ottoman Empire, they formed two independent countries, Turkey and Saudi Arabia. These were independent countries that got to rule themselves. And then the United Kingdom took all of this as colonies: Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, Kuwait, Cyprus, and Aden, which is today Yemen. And France took Lebanon and Syria as colonies. Okay? You get not, so you can see it looks like this. This is the Ottoman Empire beforehand. If you're down like that, it actually includes Bulgaria. And then afterwards, you have Turkey and Syria, Lebanon, French colonies, and all of this color, which includes Egypt, Yemen, Aden, and Kuwait, are all British colonies. So the point for our discussion here is the British now have control of Palestine. Okay? And the English never had a piece of ground on the earth that they didn't want to take over and rule. They were colonial masters par excellence. They just wanted to dominate the world. And they wanted to dominate Palestine. Now, here's where it gets really bizarre. During World War I, okay, let's go back. During World War I, the Ottoman Empire were the bad guys, so the British were fighting against them, okay? And the British were trying to, and this is Lawrence of Arabia, if you know his story, this is where he was operating, okay? And what Lawrence did for the British, he was a colonel, major, he was some ranking officer in the British Army, but he organized Arab tribes to fight against the Turks, and the Turks dominated the Ottoman Empire. So that was what was going on here, okay? And where was that? Okay, and so in that business, England, in order to gain favor of both the Arabs and the Jews, promised both of them a homeland in Israel after the war if they would support Britain during the war. Okay, called the Balfour Declaration. And they promised them the same piece of land. So each were promised the same piece of land. It was totally duplicitous on the part of the English. Of course, they were really good at that, and designed just to get their support to fight the Turks. And after the war, the UK reneged on both promises. And neither one got a state. And the British went, just kidding. You know, we won the war, you know, geez, who cares? And they were determined to keep Palestine as a British colony. And this really ticked off the Jews who were in Palestine and who kept coming there from Zion because of Zionism. And so Jews in Palestine carried out a terrorist campaign during the 1930s of bombing and assassinations of the British to try to force them to leave. Okay? Actually, Menachem Begin was one of these terrorists, and he later became Prime Minister of Israel. So. Now, of course, you know this part. Between 1934 and 1945, Nazi Germany and its allies made a serious effort to try to kill all the Jews in Europe. There were about 10 million of them before the war, and they killed 6 million. The world population was about 16 million before the war. Prior to, I mean, as this was ramping up in the 1930s, Zionism got bigger. People were saying, we got to get away from these Nazis. So a lot of them came to the United States, but because of those immigration laws in the 1920s, we weren't letting very many Jews in at all. We had very, very, very low quotas on Jews. So most of them couldn't come to the United States. We took it, Albert Einstein, because he was the world's greatest physicist. But we didn't take very many at all. So a lot of them ended up going to Israel. As we said, by 1940, 31% of Palestine was Jewish. I just thought I'd show this real quick. This is the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, Germany. It's an unbelievably powerful place. The Germans have done an amazing job of repenting for what they did to the Jews. I mean, it's amazing what they've done. They have gone full tilt on trying to make it right. But this is the above ground part of it. And then the museum itself is below ground. It's hard to see what's going on here. This may even look fake, but this is, it's hard to express how powerful this is, walking amongst all these pillars, you know.
Concrete pillars that start off below your height, but then as you walk toward the middle, they stay roughly the same height over the other side. So as you walk, you can only see in front of you, and you can see the sides of the intersection, but you feel like you're lost because you can't see the world all in here in column. And then occasionally you can see a person as they walk through it. So it's just like it's so isolated. And yeah, it's really powerful.
It's a metaphor for the Jewish experience. You know, and I don't know what architect or artist came up with it, but it was inspired. The museum itself has, you know, wonderful displays, and they're frank about this. They're saying the Germans did this. We really screwed up. We are so sorry. This is evil what we did, and they're just flat out saying that's what the deal is. There's, you know, they have testimonies of Jews. This map is interesting because it shows all the concentration camps in World War II. And I think most people didn't know there were this many concentration camps.
Yeah, you only hear about like.
You only hear about 5 or 6 that you hear about, but there were hundreds of concentration camps in World War II. Death camps. Those are 2 different things. We hear about the death camps. Mostly Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen and Dachau and things like that. Okay. Now, so after the war, the UN says, okay, enough is enough. The Jews suffered unbelievably during the war. We can't even imagine what that was like. And the UN said, okay, we gotta fix this. So before the Palestine up to 1948, the black areas here are where Jewish settlements were. The yellow areas are Palestinian population areas, and of course it was a British colony. And the British were desperately trying to hang on to it, but the British Empire was in the process of falling apart after World War II, and they knew it, and they decided not to resist the UN on this. So here's the UN plan right here, this map in the middle. The green is going to be the state of Palestine, and the blue is going to be the state of Israel. So they tried to come up with a way of sharing the land between the two. And these are going to be countries. There's going to be a country of Palestine and a country of Israel. And since Jerusalem is holy to both cities, both faiths, they decided to make it an open city, basically. It wouldn't be controlled by either one. It's essentially what that is going to be all about. That's why it's in white there. The Palestinians were excited about having a state, which they'd wanted for a long time, but they were really irritated by the fact that a decided minority of the population, the Jews, were getting some of the best land, and were getting land which is actually more than what the Palestinians got. And so they launched attacks against the Jews. And the Jews responded, and we had the 1948 war. And after the 1948 war, which the Jews, the Israelis won, they pushed the boundaries to the blue zone, and we have a state of Israel and no state of Palestine at all. And at this point, the Palestinians fled Israel and went to this area here, which is the West Bank, and this area here, which is Gaza. Okay? So that's where they ended up there, and they ended up in refugee camps. And no refugee camp that's ever existed is a nice place to be. I can promise you that. These are rough places. Now, in 1967, so 20 years later, Israel launched a surprise war against its Arab neighbors, with the intent was to take the areas in red. This is what they ended up doing. They took the areas in red. The West Bank, it's called the West Bank because this is the Jordan River right there, and this is the West Bank of the Jordan River. Okay? It's the bank on the west side of the Jordan River. That's why it's called the West Bank. So they conquered Gaza, West Bank, and the Golan Heights, which is part of Syria. And remember, this is where all of the Palestinian refugees had gone after they were driven out in 1948. And so suddenly now, in 1967, Israel is in control of millions of Palestinians. And Israel wanted to keep this, what? Yes?
What was the incentive for them to do that?
They wanted to expand their territory, and they wanted to, they said it was in terms of national security as well. They wanted to have more secure borders. There's also some elements of it, and there's different elements in all of this, but some elements of it said, we want to recreate the kingdom of David, and David being the greatest king of Israel in the Bible. And his kingdom went all the way over here, including most of Jordan. Excuse me. Most of Jordan. And, you know, I've lost my teaching voice now that I'm retired. I used to be able to talk all day long, and now I'm just already getting scratchy here. But anyway, some wanted to recreate the kingdom of David, but that wasn't the main thing. That was a non-starter from the beginning, you know. And to solidify their claim to this land, they weren't going to give it back. And they have been condemned by the United Nations ever since 1967 for militarily occupying this land and not giving it back, you know. But they're not going to give it back. Well, they gave the Gaza back, but we'll get to that in a minute. And to solidify their claims, they started moving settlers into there, especially into the West Bank, but also into Gaza. They started moving people in and moving a lot of people in, colonists who were going in, Israeli colonists who were going in, to the occupied territories. So when you hear them talk about the occupied territories, we're talking about the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan Heights. Okay. Now the Palestinians really want their own country. They really do. Historically, Israel has strongly opposed this. They are unwilling to give up land and control of water to Palestinians. They just don't want to do that. And they view an independent state of Palestine as a threat to their security. So they are not on board with this, you know, Palestinian state, even though the United Nations said in 1947 that you should have a Palestinian state. But the United States, the European Union, and the United Nations all favor both a state of Israel and a state of Palestine. Most of the rest of the world does, in fact. Which seems like a logical progression towards trying to solve this problem. If we can have each of them have a state, you know. Now, starting in 1987 and going through the next few years, there was this thing called the Intifada. By that point in time, we're talking about another 20 years now after Israel took the West Bank and Gaza and all that. By that point in time, Palestinians were getting really, really frustrated. And you can see by 1987, some of them had been in refugee camps for 40 years at that point. And the Israelis were coming into the West Bank and occupying the best territory and forcing the Palestinians to move to less desirable territory. And this is happening in Gaza to some degree as well. And so they finally just said, okay, enough. And they had mass demonstrations, and it's called the Intifada. You know, Israel put it down rather harshly, using military force. Palestinians weren't shooting guns or anything like that. They were throwing rocks, and they were demonstrating a non-cooperation and things like that. The Israelis were, put it down militarily. But it triggered an amazing thing that happened. Bill Clinton, when he was president of the United States, sponsored and organized talks between Israel and the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, led by Yasser Arafat, and that PLO evolves into the Palestinian Authority, which is what they're called now. But it's PLO then, and the PLO and Israel were talking in Oslo, Norway, and they agreed, the PLO agreed that Israel had a right to exist, which was a major turning point. And Israel agreed to give limited Palestinian autonomy in the West Bank and in Gaza. Limited self-rule, but limited. And as I said, PLO is the Palestinian Authority, which is what you hear about today. Now, the Palestinian Authority, since that time, has administered Palestinian affairs on the West Bank in certain parts of the West Bank, and we'll see that map in a minute. Israel has placed hundreds of thousands of settlers in the West Bank, and you'll see the distribution of where they are, and you'll realize why the Palestinians are ticked off. But the Palestinian Authority was unable to stop this. They didn't have the power to stop the Israelis from doing this, because the Israelis have security control over the West Bank. In other words, their military can go in there anytime they want, they can fly over it, and they can do it. In 2005, something else amazing happened. Israel finally decided just to give up control of the Gaza Strip, which is down here. Okay? And people are saying, oh, great, independent state of Palestine. But the problem is Gaza is completely inappropriate as a homeland for the Palestinians. Because, first of all, it would deny Palestinian access to Jerusalem, which is right there. It would cut off Palestinian access to the Jordan River, which is the main source of water for everybody in this part of the world. It's very small. I don't think people in the United States appreciate how small Gaza is. 139 square miles. Grant County that we live in is about 10 times bigger. So 1/10 of Grant County is Gaza, or 1/9, actually, something like that.
And how many people?
We're getting to that in a minute, too. But it's too small. And we're going to see the implications of what that's all about. And it doesn't have sufficient resources to make a state. They just don't have the resources it takes to have a country. So from a Palestinian perspective, any independent state of Palestine must include the West Bank, has to include the West Bank. And Israel is extremely reluctant to grant the West Bank to the Palestinians because they want guaranteed access to the Jordan River. They want unimpeded access to Jerusalem. They want space in the West Bank to settle even more Israelis. And they see the control of the West Bank as a national security issue. Okay? So let's look at the West Bank. I did this for Matt. I didn't know. But here's a map showing the distribution of Palestinians and Jews in the West Bank. The white areas are the Jewish areas. Notice all of the Jordan River is under Jewish control, every bit of it. This is by far and away the most desirable part of the West Bank, and the Jews took all of it. The green is where the Palestinians are, and there's, inroads in here of Jewish settlement. The black line is a giant border wall that the Israelis have built to wall off the Palestinians from Israel, which is over here. And you'll see a picture of that wall in a minute. So 400,000 Israelis now live here. 400,000 more Israelis live in East Jerusalem, which is this area right here. That's why the wall goes over here and includes them in Israel. And notice that Jerusalem is entirely in Israel and not in Palestine or not in the West Bank, which is going to be a problem for the Palestinians. This is a sacred city for them. And about 2.75 million Palestinians live over here in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So the Oslo Accords in 1993 that we talked about divided this up into 3 zones, the West Bank. Zone A, which is the, what's this, salmon colored? Orange color, whatever it is. Those are areas which are controlled and administered by Palestinians. You see there's very, very little of that, but there are some areas which are controlled by the Palestinians and administered by them by the Palestinian Authority. B is the yellow areas, and those are controlled by Israel, but administered by the Palestinians, so they have to do what Israelis say, basically. And then C, which is the green areas, are controlled and administered by Israel, which you see is the vast majority of the West Bank, and including all of the area along the Jordan. Here's why I keep talking about the Jordan River. This is one of the most water-poor areas in the world. There's a way of measuring water use, and it's water per capita. In other words, how much water is there available for each person living in that area in cubic meters per year. So skipping to this one right here, water per capita in 2020 is 153 cubic meters per person per year in Israel, 111 in Jordan, and 59 in Palestine. Now, it's generally assumed that anything below 1,000 means you're a water poor country. And even the best, Israel, is 153, way below 1,000. So all of these areas rank in the bottom 20% of countries worldwide, and some in the bottom 5%. For comparison, the world average is 5,500 cubic meters per year per person. So you see how that compares to this. Although that's down from 1961 because water is becoming a bigger and bigger problem. And it's going to get to be a real big problem in the 21st century. You guys are all going to live to see fresh water being one of the many most important issues that climate change is doing to the world. In the United States, we average 8,500 cubic meters per year in the United States. So we're not at all water poor. And you compare that to what they've got. So water is everything. And the Jordan River is the main source of water. And so the Israelis are not going to give up that control of that water. And the Palestinians have to have some control of that water for their own use. And yet you see they're not getting it. And the reason why they're getting far less water than the Israelis is because they're charged up to 3 times more water in the West Bank than are Israelis. Because the Israelis control the water and they charge the Palestinians more. And here's the Israeli security wall under construction, actually, which cuts off some sources of water, like all of the Jordan River is cut off by this. So water is huge in this whole thing. Again, it's about land and water. It's not about religion. So here's the Jordan River, flows out of the Sea of Galilee, straight south, empties into the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea, as you may know, is salty, so it's not a good water source. The Sea of Galilee is a good water source. It's fresh, and northern Israel can use that. But of course, the West Bank and Gaza don't have any access to the Sea of Galilee, and they don't have access to the Jordan River either, because the Israelis have got all that land. Now let's look at Gaza. Gaza is 139 square miles in area, 25 miles long, and between 4 and 8 miles wide. So you can cut the whole thing in a day, except it's probably going to be 105 degrees and you probably melt. But 2.4 million Palestinians live there, giving a population density of about 17,000 per square mile. Now, population densities of other places per square mile, the United States as a country is 96 compared to 17,000 here. Wisconsin is 109. Grant County, where we live, is 45. Lancaster is 1,300 per square mile. Platteville is 1,900. We're a big city, see? That's a joke, son. Milwaukee is 6,000 and Chicago is 12,000. So we're talking about the Gaza Strip as a population density 50% higher than Chicago does. Now you can imagine in a place that's limited on water and limited on resources, and you've got that kind of population density, this is a humanitarian disaster that's unfolding and has been unfolding for decades. So Israel took military control of the Gaza Strip during the 1967 war. The 1993 Oslo Accords give Israel full control of Gaza airspace, as well as control of offshore waters in the Mediterranean, so they control all of this. Plus, they control the air. Palestinians don't have an air force. And then the state of Israel borders Gaza on the north and on the east. And on the south, it borders Egypt. But because, I'm skipping ahead, but because of Israeli and Egypt negotiated settlements, the Israelis can control what flows across this border as well. So Israel has complete control over the flow of resources in and out of Gaza. After the Oslo Accords in 1993, Palestinian Authority administered the Gaza Strip along with the West Bank in the Palestinian areas. But Israel still had military control, basically, of both places. As we said, in 2005, Israel decided to remove all Israeli settlers from Gaza and withdraw their military from the area. They just walked away. They left it. And as a result, Gaza held elections in 2005 for whoever's going to be in charge. And the two groups that were running for power were the Palestinian Authority, who had been in charge since 1993, and Hamas. They were the two groups that were competing in this election. Hamas won. They got more votes, and they had more seats in the Legislative Assembly. The Palestinian Authority was tainted in the view of a lot of Palestinians because of their inability to stop the Israeli settlements in the West Bank. They were seen as being weak and maybe even collaborating with the Israelis. That's probably unfair, but that was the perception. In 2007, Hamas took complete control of Gaza, non-democratically. So in other words, there are no more elections, or if they are, they're jerry-rigged. And Israel hates Hamas. By the way, Hamas and the Palestinian Authority hate each other. They do not get along. The Palestinians are not a unified group by any stretch of the imagination. There are a whole bunch of people in Gaza that don't like Hamas at all. And so with that in mind, don't think of Palestinians as being one unified group. And certainly don't conflate Hamas with the average Palestinian. Okay, that's not a good connection to make. Yeah.
And to add a little more color there, so the Palestinian Authority is more sectarian, more not religious.
Right, secular.
Secular, more secular. Hamas is straight up.
Yeah.
Religious, Islam, fanatic.
They came from the Muslim Brotherhood, which was a extremely enthusiastic group that is all about using force and violence that they have to advance a particular form of Islam. And keep in mind that Islam is not a monotheistic religion. It's a monotheistic religion. It's not a monolithic religion. There's all different kinds of Muslims. There are all different kinds of Muslims. And a lot of them don't like the Muslim Brotherhood. They don't like Hamas. But that's their version of it, okay? But anyway, Israel doesn't like Hamas because it's considered radical. It is radical, even though not just considered, it is. So they sealed the border with Gaza. Remember, they controlled all the flow of materials in and out of Gaza. In 2007, they sealed the border and would carefully regulated what would go in and go out. And they still controlled the airspace, and they still controlled the water, and they still controlled the land crossings. And so what Israeli policy is all about was to try to limit the amount of resources going in to try to starve Hamas out. to try to make things bad enough that people will turn on Hamas. And so there's been a lot of serious suffering. So they have shortages of food, water, electricity, and medicine. And they have had since 2007. It's been a really tough place. Now, Hamas worked out agreements with other Mideastern countries, and they're figured out ways to get materials to Gaza. So that's the only thing that's kept them going, actually, is the support of Iran and Qatar, those two major ones, Egypt to some degree. Okay. There are still 8 refugee camps in Gaza. These are refugee camps that formed in 1948. And they're still there. There are also cities, Gaza City, which is where all the fighting is going on right now. They're downtown Gaza right now. So these are the 8 refugee camps in Gaza that are still there. So as I said, Hamas is considered a terrorist organization by a lot of people in the West, including the United States. And Israel obviously considers them terrorists. They said they've been armed by other Mideastern countries as well as food and electricity and water, and they were getting them arms as well. So they have periodically launched rocket strikes into Israel. And of course, the recent cross-border incursion into Israel, which is sort of unprecedented, was by far and away the most fatal and the most brutal attack by Hamas against Israel. And it was indeed brutal, it was indeed terroristic, and we need to make sure that's really clear. Now, if it came out of a history of frustration and anger, okay, but still it's terroristic, and you don't go do stuff like that. You don't go kill women and children, rape people, and take hostages. You just don't do that. That's what a terrorist group does. About 1,400 Israelis were killed in that raid, as you know. 240 were taken hostage to be traded for Palestinians held by Israel. Palestinians refusing, Israel's refusing to negotiate on those 240 hostages. And they have said that they're going to fight in Gaza until those 240 hostages are released and Hamas is crushed. That's what they're doing in Israel right now. So Israel's response to that, as you know, a massive bombing campaign, followed by a ground invasion, which is where they are now. They're in Gaza fighting right now. Palestinian death toll as of yesterday was over 11,000. Of those, 4,500 are children, about 3,000 are women, about 700 are elderly. So a lot of civilian casualties from the Israeli invasion. It is not possible to wage war in areas densely populated as Gaza without killing a lot of civilians. You just can't do it. They're everywhere. If you're going to do anything, you're going to kill civilians. So this has fueled international outcry, asking Israel for a ceasefire to stop the invasion. Israel has refused to do that, and they have said, we are not going to stop until Hamas is completely eradicated and the hostages are released. They've also have plans to occupy Gaza militarily after the war is over. They're not going to leave. They're going to stay and remilitarize the area. And so that's where we are right now. And it's only 11:32, so I didn't do too bad on time. Comments, yes.
One more thing about one of the reasons on my stuff that I listed, one of the reasons why Hamas was able to successfully pull off a surprise attack.
Yeah, it was a surprise attack, yeah.
Is that they have effectively put in an underground maze.
Yes, they have.
And that's where they have been working out of. Effectively been working underground on stuff, which is scary because it's underneath things that are important. So it's hard to bomb where people are at. It's harder to find them all. So they basically are using the top surface right you can to shield over what they're doing.
And Israel has, because of that, Israel is using very large explosive bombs which hit the surface and blow out everything underneath, hoping to get some of those underground things as well, which caused a lot of damage because of how densely populated it is, yeah. Yeah, we don't like Hamas. We have a long-standing relationship with Israel. And so we are 100% supporting Israel in this. But we've also are trying to pressure Israel to allow humanitarian goods to go in, to have at least temporary ceasefires. And Israel has announced recently they're going to have a few hours every day when they're going to back off the fighting to allow humanitarian stuff to come in, but it's not clear where that's going to be in the area, if it's going to be everywhere or just in certain areas. But they're going to allow some humanitarian aid to come in because the humanitarian crisis, which was there anyway, has gotten just 100 times worse. You can imagine, I think, I've forgotten the number. Some of you read the same things I'm reading. 70% of all Palestinians in Gaza are now homeless. Is that right? What was the number? It's about 70, I think, percent. Don't quote me on that number, but I think that's what it is now. They're homeless. They don't have a place to live. I don't know what the UN's going to do. The UN is hamstrung partially by all the divisions in the world. And since we're on the Security Council, we carry a lot of weight in the UN. And so probably we'll support Israel. The UN might support Israel, but at the same time, they have condemnation of UN, of Israel for occupying the occupied territories. And that's something we couldn't stop. Yeah. And that is, most people think that is the solution. You've got to get 2 states in there. And Israel still does not want to do that. The problem is where we put them. You know, we're talking about not much space. Israel's not that big of a country either, you know. We're going to have 2 really small countries with a whole lot of people and limited water resources and limited agricultural resources because it's dry. You know, it's just a mess from the beginning. It is probably getting drier because of climate change, yes. You know, a lot of places are, and that's one of the places that seems to be going that direction. Some places are getting wetter, but it seems like the Middle East is getting drier. Like the Southwest United States, like Australia, are all getting much drier. So it's one of those situations where everybody's right and everybody's wrong, you know, and everybody wants the same land. And you know, way better people than us have tried to figure this out and couldn't do it. I blame the British for a lot. You can't imagine how messed up the world is because of British colonial policy. It is unbelievable how much they messed up the world. But that's another story. That could be a whole nother Education Sunday if you want. But they have messed up a lot of things. But there's a lot of blame to go around here. There certainly is. Hamas is to blame. You can say Israel's to blame for their treatment of the Palestinians. You can say all kinds of things.